When I came here, I was 8 years old. Come to a new environment. Actually, the first day I arrived in Canada was, I remember, March 7th. That was one of the worst snowstorms ever in Montreal. And in Hong Kong, you don't see a drop of snow. All of a sudden, you come into the country, everything's white, and the snow is taller than you. And it kind of feels really strange.
Still, for new immigrants, Montreal was seen as the most welcoming and supportive city in the country. A place that made it easier to bring family members to Canada.
Many Chinese people first went to Montreal for a very specific reason. Okay, in those good old days, the French people in Quebec, the Quebecois, were more receptive. And in fact, Montreal was a much bigger city than Toronto in the old days.
Therefore, sometimes people find more easily to come to Canada by applying to stay in Montreal. And after we become a landed immigrant in Montreal and in Quebec, they move out to Ontario. That's why some people complaining that Montreal get all the investment, but then after immigrants come to Ontario and get the benefit from the Ontario.
Indeed, many Chinese did leave the province in the 80s and 90s for both economic and political reasons. But then came a new wave of wealthy immigrants from Hong Kong and elsewhere.
We have a lot of young immigrants came from China and from also other countries around the world. They are Chinese origin, but they came from different countries, moved to Canada to live in Montreal. So you can see obviously this community is very active.
Active and incredibly diverse, with many in the community not just bilingual, but multilingual.
The Chinatown in Montreal is a little bit different with the other cities. They combine the three-four language. The Chinatown culture is different in Montreal.
It's different in other ways as well. Unlike other Canadian Chinatowns, there's a certain familiarity to this one. The fact is, it hasn't changed all that much over the years.
Montreal is like Montreal 40 years ago, whereas Toronto is Toronto like today, contemporary, completely different. So you come to Toronto, it's very cosmopolitan. But Montreal is as if you go back to memory lane. Nothing much has changed. Walking in St. Laurent, walking in St. Urbain, it's as if you were back to the late 60s.
And everywhere you look, reminders of a past that was rich and colorful, but not always easy.
Real Canadian Superstore 嘅食物同日常用品應有盡有，而且物超所值，陪你歡度中秋佳節。本週超值推介紅雞排活利香米，10塊1公斤，25.9毫8，剩翻20毫包36.9毫8。新鮮白菜每磅3毫8，曲牌甜辣醬800克1蚊7毫8，八道即食碗麵86克1蚊2個，或每個7毫9。Coco 牌椰青水520毫升8毫8，六罐以上每罐1蚊零8。產品選擇全面，價格超值正心。Real Canadian Superstore 同你一齊慶祝中秋佳節。
Back to school is about to get a lot more exciting. Get dual-core laptops with 3 gigs of RAM for $399.99 and a dual-core laptop with 4 gigs of RAM for just $429.99. Future Shop. Exciting stuff.
Just add your personality, you and Cheese Whiz will make your family day. Just spread it, pour it, there's one other latte. For snacks, why not melt it too? With real Canadian cheddar, it's fun to try something new. Cheese Whiz adds your personality, add your personality. Cheese Whiz adds your personality. Never seen the sky so blue. The birds are singing, got nothing to say.
where Goldie Hawn got her start on television. The bubbly young blonde caught producer George Schlotter's eye in 1968 and was hired for a small part in Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. After flubbing her lines in an audition, she had the cast and crew in stitches, and Schlotter knew he had found a star. Goldie quickly became known as the Giggle Girl.
But she didn't giggle as much as George Schlatter wanted her to giggle. They used to turn her cards upside down. When she was giggling on Laughing, it wasn't because she couldn't read the cards. They would misspell things. They would hold the cards sideways or upside to make her look silly and giggly. We spoke about it. Very soon after that, when she was on the show, she just trying to make me look stupid on that show. And I said, well, it's sort of working. People are interested.
The first Chinese came to Montreal from the United States in the mid-1800s, and so began the first Chinese laundries.
The first Chinese landing in Montreal is W.H. Lee. Another one is Charlie Lee. So therefore, the Montreal first family is Lee's family. In 1877, the first Chinese laundry opened at Quebec Street.
Years later, the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railroad led to a new influx of Chinese immigrants from Western Canada, looking for a place to finally call home.
Most of the Chinese community in early years are all from people from Taishan in the southern part of China. They're here for the railroad. They're here afterward after the railroad was built. They have no chance to go back to China, and they just stayed here. And many of them travel east, and a lot of them settled in Montreal.
They settled here and established a permanent presence, redefining the city's cultural and architectural landscape. What turned out to be a Chinatown landmark, the Wing Building, was actually built in 1826, before there were any Chinese people in Montreal. Over the years, it's been a lot of things to a lot of different people.
This building, it was built in 1824. The building, it was an American military academy. So it's American military school. Then after that, the school moved out, and they used this building as a textiles or storage for the garment, for the paper.
After the war, Wing's Noodles moved in and became famous for making the world's only fortune cookies that are both kosher and bilingual. That and, of course, noodles. Lots and lots of noodles.
I still remember one of the largest institutions in Chinatown was the Wing Heng Noodle Factory. And even today, after so many years, they still supply most of the noodles in Canada, Chinese noodles.
Right next to Wing's Noodles on Côté Street is the building that first housed the Chinese Freemasons, the oldest organization of Chinese people in Montreal.
But the next building was Qigong. Actually, it's a Chinese Freemason. The owner, one is Chu is Chen and one is Yip. It's actually from Vancouver. They come over there. First, they are in not far from the Windsor station. It was the first location over there. It's Qigong Tong. But after that, they moved in here.
And moved here to Clark Street, where the Freemasons continue to serve the Chinese community. The street still has many old buildings which, if they could talk, would have 1,000 fascinating tales to tell.
Clark Street is not far from St. Lawrence Boulevard. Around here is lots of small stores. In the old time, the architecture, they built the house is very small, very small. And that building is a Chinese restaurant. But in the first floor, it was a gambling house, a casino. And even some people smoked opium in the old time. In 1913, the first Chinese Cantonese cuisine. After that, this building on the first floor, there's snake bar. And the second floor is a restaurant named Nanjing. The sign is still up there. And And the third floor is a Roman house.
Today, of course, Chinatown is a bustling place, all sorts of businesses, shops, and cultural activities. It wasn't always so.
St. Albanians in Oran were the heart of Chinatown in Montreal. They were actually very close to old Montreal still. At the time, they had populated many Chinese restaurants, a few Chinese laundries. It looks like in the early days, most Chinese immigrants were focused on two businesses, just restaurants and laundries.
That all began to change in the 1970s. Gradually, the rooming houses and Chinese laundries began to disappear. The younger generation wanted something better for themselves.
The Chinese laundry in 1975 almost closed all. Maybe have 1 or 2% still open. But after that, it's closed. Because the laundryman, his family, the young generation, they go into the restaurant or they go to school and they better education, and maybe they could find some jobs, better jobs, not in the restaurant or not in the laundry.
But we're also getting a bit more professional offices because more and more younger Chinese people get into different professions like lawyers and doctors, architects, engineers that hardly existed 30 to 40 years ago. So that sort of change, slowly but surely changed the face of Chinatown.
That decade saw even more changes, including a huge demographic shift that started in 1979. That's when Canada accepted more than 50,000 Vietnamese refugees. They were known as the Boat People, who were themselves an incredibly diverse group. That influx would change the face of Montreal's Chinatown forever.
From Vietnam, from Cambodia, Laos, then you have a lot of what they call boat people. They will end up here in Montreal. And only at the time you see a lot of Chinese Vietnamese who start bringing their culture and also their lifestyle here in Montreal. And you're seeing the food restaurants that start developing around, and also some grocery stores and all that.
Instead of just having dim sum, fried noodles, now we're getting more Vietnamese style, like noodles, and also a little bit of Northern Chinese hot food, Sichuan food, for example, which did not exist in the old past.
It wasn't just the menu that was changing. The Vietnamese brought a whole new way of doing business.
Since the coming of the Vietnamese immigrants, and they seem to specialize in two kinds of business, besides the noodle shops. One of them is gold. They love gold. Okay, whenever you want to buy gold, go to the Vietnamese shop. They have lots of it. The second is cash. Now, what's meant by cash? They have special shops to help people cash their checks, so they can mail the money back home. So those things are quite different from 30 to 40 years ago. They did not even exist in those days.
The changes are reflected everywhere, in the shops and restaurants and other businesses that have sprung up and continue to flourish.
You look across the country today, most of the grocery stores and most of the business are really owned by Chinese, Vietnamese, or Chinese from Southeast Asia. And only afterward, when they start developing St. Lawrence Street in the 80s and 90s, and there's a new wave of Chinese immigrants, investor immigrants and business immigrants from Hong Kong. They came over to Montreal, and you're seeing a lot more restaurants, a lot more shops, and that's why St. Lawrence Street is more expanded now as to, I think, the business street now in Chinatown.
A vibrant place, forging a new future, but at the same time, working hard to preserve the past.